The ocean was calm that morning. To calm, passengers stood along the railings, staring into the endless gray-blue water of the Atlantic. Some laughed, some read newspapers, some held children close, pointing toward the distant horizon where New York should have been waiting. They believed the danger was behind them. After all, the warning had already been printed, quietly, almost politely. A notice placed in American newspapers had cautioned travelers that British ships crossing war zones might be attacked. But the words felt distant, abstract, easy to ignore. The Lusitania was not just any ship. It was a floating palace, faster than submarines, they said, too important to sink, they claimed. And besides, civilians were untouchable, or so they believed. At 2:10 p.m., everything changed. A single explosion tore through the starboard side of the ship. Then, something far more terrifying followed. A second blast, deeper, louder, wrong. Within minutes, the Atlantic Ocean began swallowing one of the most luxurious ships ever built, and with it, over 1,000 lives. But this is not just the story of a ship that sank. This is the story of secrets buried beneath the waves, of warnings ignored, of truths rewritten, and of a tragedy that may not have been as innocent as history wants us to believe. The RMS Lusitania was launched as a symbol of progress, speed, power, confidence, a British ocean liner designed not just to transport people, but to project dominance across the sea. By 1915, Europe was burning. World War I had turned continents into battlefields, and the ocean into a silent hunting ground. German U-boats prowled beneath the surface, unseen and unforgiving, yet the Lusitania sailed anyway. On board were nearly 2,000 souls, businessmen, families, artists, mothers holding infants who would never learn to walk, children who had never known the sound of war, and hidden among their luggage, something else, something that should not have been there. Officially, the Lusitania was a civilian ship, unarmed, neutral in spirit, if not in flag. But whispers followed it across the ocean, crates loaded in secret, manifests that didn't quite add up. Cargo listed vaguely, carefully, small arms, ammunition, they would later admit. Harmless, they said, necessary, they claimed. But when the torpedoes struck, witnesses described something that didn't fit the story. The second explosion. Survivors spoke of it in hushed voices. Some said it came from deep within the ship. Others said it felt different, more violent, more final. And for decades, the question lingered in the shadows. What caused it? Chaos erupted instantly. Lifeboats were lowered too fast. Others smashed against the side of the ship. Some overturned, spilling screaming passengers into the freezing water below. The ship listed sharply. Time collapsed. What should have taken hours happened in 18 minutes. 18 that was all the time the Lusitania gave its passengers to understand they were about to die. Parents tied children to furniture, hoping the wood would float. Strangers clung to each other, not for survival, but for comfort. A woman was seen standing still, perfectly calm, adjusting her gloves as the deck tilted beneath her feet. The ocean does not care how prepared you are. When the Lusitania slipped beneath the waves, the screams did not stop. They echoed across the water. Then, slowly faded, one by one, replaced by silence. By the time rescue ships arrived, the Atlantic was covered with bodies, floating reminders of a moment the world would never forget. Or would it? The aftermath shocked the United States. Among the dead were 128 Americans. Newspapers exploded with outrage. Germany was condemned. Posters demanded justice. The sinking was portrayed as an unprovoked act of barbarism, a crime against humanity. And yet, something was missing. Questions were avoided. Testimonies were softened. The second explosion was downplayed, dismissed, quietly buried under official explanations. Why? Because the truth complicated the narrative. If the Lusitania had been carrying war materials, then it was not entirely innocent. If Britain knowingly placed civilians above hidden cargo, then the blame shifted. If warnings were ignored on purpose, then this tragedy was not just an attack. It was a calculated risk, and risks have victims. In the years that followed, divers would explore the wreck. Governments would seal documents. Survivors would die, taking their memories with them. History books would simplify the story into clean lines and moral clarity, good versus evil, victims and villains. But reality is rarely that simple. The Lusitania rests on the ocean floor now, broken and silent, a graveyard of steel and unanswered questions. The Atlantic moves above it, as if nothing ever happened. Yet beneath those waves lies more than wreckage. There lies a moment when truth became inconvenient, when lives were weighed against strategy, when the line between civilian and weapon blurred beyond recognition. And the most disturbing part is this: the sinking of the Lusitania did not just change the war, it taught the world a lesson it would repeat again and again, that in times of conflict, innocence is often the first thing sacrificed, and the first thing erased from memory. And the ocean remembers everything. The ocean closed over the Lusitania as if sealing a secret. What remained on the surface was debris, bodies, and disbelief. But beneath the waves, something far heavier sank with the ship: truth. In the hours after the disaster, survivors were questioned again and again. Officials wanted order, simplicity, a clear enemy. They did not want uncertainty. They did not want whispers about cargo, or unexplained explosions, or decisions made far above the heads of ordinary passengers. Some witnesses spoke anyway. They described the second blast in detail, how it seemed to come from inside the ship, not from the sea, how it shook the decks differently, how it accelerated the sinking in a way a single torpedo should not have. Others were more careful. They softened their words, or stopped talking altogether. Shock does that to people. So does pressure. Within days, narratives hardened. Germany was declared solely responsible. The torpedo was the cause. End of story. But history, when examined closely, rarely ends so neatly. Far from the grieving families, in offices filled with maps and cables, men studied the consequences. The sinking of the Lusitania had done something extraordinary. It had shifted public emotion. The outrage was real, the anger visceral. For the first time, many Americans felt the war was not distant. It had reached across the ocean and touched them personally. This mattered. The United States was still officially neutral, but neutrality was fragile. Public opinion could tip the balance faster than any army, and the Lusitania became more than a tragedy. It became a tool. Posters appeared, speeches were given, newspapers repeated the same images, the same phrases, the same carefully chosen words. Innocent lives, unprovoked attack. A line had been crossed. But beneath the surface of this moral clarity, uncomfortable facts remained buried. Why had the ship been allowed to sail through known submarine zones? Why were escorts not provided? Why were warnings treated as formalities rather than real threats? And most importantly, what exactly was in the cargo hold? Decades later, when technology allowed humans to reach the wreck itself, the questions resurfaced. Divers reported stacks of ammunition, rifle cartridges, war supplies, items that had no place on a purely civilian liner. Items that explained the second explosion far better than any official report ever had. Suddenly, survivor testimonies made sense. The Lusitania had not just been carrying people, it had been carrying war. This revelation did not erase German responsibility. A torpedo was still fired. Lives were still lost. But it shattered the illusion of innocence that history had so carefully constructed. The passengers had not been told the full truth. The public had not been told the full truth. And the dead could no longer speak for themselves. They had trusted the ship, trusted the flag it sailed under, trusted that civilians would not be used as shields for strategy. That trust sank with them. The human cost did not end in the water. Families waited for bodies that never returned. Mothers identified children by fragments of clothing. Survivors lived with guilt that no medal or compensation could erase. Some woke screaming at night, hearing the sound of metal tearing. Others avoided the ocean for the rest of their lives. A few refused to speak of it at all, as if silence could bury memory the way water buried steel. History books moved on. The Lusitania became a paragraph, a date, a justification. But for those who lived through it, time did not soften the edges. It sharpened them. They understood something the world preferred to forget, that their suffering had been useful. The ship's wreck remains on the ocean floor today, slowly collapsing under pressure, rust, and time. It is treated as a grave, protected by law, untouched by most, and yet, even in death, it is controversial. Because graves are supposed to hold truth. The Lusitania holds questions. It asks whether governments value lives more than leverage. It asks whether civilians are ever truly separate from war. It asks how easily horror can be reshaped into a clean, patriotic story. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this. If the truth had been known in 1915, would those passengers have boarded the ship? Would the parents have kissed their children goodbye the same way? Would the laughter on deck have sounded so carefree? Would anyone have believed the sea was safe? We will never know. The ocean keeps its answers. History edits its versions. And somewhere between the two lies the real story of the Lusitania, not just a ship sunk by a torpedo, but a moment when humanity learned, once again, that in times of war, truth often drowns long before the victims do. The water above the wreck is calm now. Ships pass overhead without slowing. Most people never think about what lies beneath them. But beneath that calm surface, the Lusitania still rests, waiting, not to be remembered, but to be understood. Silence followed understanding, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that settles after something irreversible has already happened. The kind that arrives when questions outnumber answers, and guilt has nowhere left to go. For years after the sinking, officials insisted the matter was settled. Reports were filed, statements archived, responsibility assigned. The world moved forward, as it always does. Wars continued, ships sailed, new disasters replaced old ones in the public memory. But beneath the surface, unease remained, because the Lusitania was not an accident of fate. It was the result of decisions, calculated decisions made far from the deck, far from the lifeboats, far from the screams, and decisions leave shadows. The men who authorized the voyage never stood on the slanted decks as water rushed in. They never felt the Atlantic claw at their lungs. They never held dying strangers in their arms while the ship groaned and collapsed around them. Yet their choices shaped every second of those final 18 minutes. Some historians argue the risk was justified, that war demands sacrifice, that the shipment was small, insignificant compared to the broader conflict, that Germany would have attacked regardless. Others disagree. They point to patterns, to intelligence reports that predicted submarine activity, to warnings that were minimized, to routes that were not altered, to escorts that were not assigned. They suggest something darker, that the Lusitania was allowed to sail exposed because outrage was valuable, because a tragedy involving civilians would do what diplomacy could not, because public emotion can be weaponized. And if that is true, then the sinking was not only a crime of war, it was a manipulation of humanity itself. Survivors lived long enough to watch the world justify their suffering. They watched textbooks describe the event in clean sentences. They watched speeches praise sacrifice without mentioning deception. They watched anniversaries pass with wreaths laid, but questions unanswered. Some tried to speak again later in life. They were dismissed as unreliable, traumatized, confused by time. Memory, they were told, is fragile. But memory was all they had. The deeper researchers looked, the more fragmented the truth became. Documents contradicted one another. Testimonies vanished from archives. Files were sealed, then partially released, then quietly reclassified. History became a puzzle with missing pieces, and missing pieces are rarely accidental. What emerged instead was a pattern of erasure. Not total silence, but selective memory. Enough truth to appear honest, enough omission to remain comfortable. The Lusitania, in this version of history, was tragic but simple. Real history is rarely either. Today, the wreck lies broken, its structure collapsing inward, year by year. Iron dissolves, wood disappears, but the cargo, sealed, submerged, preserved, remains stubbornly present. Divers describe it as unsettling, not because of ghosts, but because of what the wreck represents. A frozen moment where civilians and warfare overlapped completely. A place where innocence and strategy shared the same space. The ocean has no opinion. It does not judge motives or intentions. It simply keeps what it is given. And what it was given in 1915 was more than a ship, it was trust. The sinking of the Lusitania changed how the world fought wars, not immediately and not visibly, but subtly, permanently. It blurred the line between civilian and combatant. It proved that technology could make death impersonal and distant. It showed that outrage could be cultivated, guided, and aimed. It taught governments something they would remember for generations, that public perception is as powerful as any weapon. And it taught civilians something far more painful, that being innocent does not mean being protected. The Atlantic looks the same now as it did then. Gray, endless, indifferent. Planes cross above it in hours. Ships cross it in days. No one feels fear looking at its surface anymore. But beneath that surface, the Lusitania remains exactly where it fell. Not screaming, not burning, not sinking, waiting for a world willing to accept that history is not just what happened, but what was allowed to happen. That tragedy is not always an accident, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing aboard a ship is not a torpedo, but a secret. The ocean will never give the Lusitania back, but it does not need to, because its lesson still floats, invisible yet heavy, above the water we call calm, reminding us that when truth is submerged long enough, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the deep, and the deep remembers everything.